Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. Welcome to the latest event in our webinar series. This one is entitled The Assault Against Free Speech, featuring Dave Raboy and Kyle Scheidler. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. First, you're all in listen-only mode, but you can interact by text in the Q&A box on your GoToWebinar control panel. And we will be recording this event. It will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and will be posted on our website, securefreedom.org. I will now hand it over to our Director and Senior Analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, Kyle Scheidler.
Thank you, Adam. I'm joining you today, and joining me is my good friend, Dave Raboy. Dave is a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy. He's also president of Strategic Improvisation, a communications company focused on clients in the national security world. He's also a fellow of the Claremont Institute, a Lincoln Fellow, and former vice president for strategic communications at the Center for Security Policy. Dave's going to be joining us by phone today due to a slight video challenge that we ran into at the last moment. But Dave, we are glad to have you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. We've had some technical difficulties, but I think we'll be good.
Okay. I was like, yet another attack on Dave's free speech is apparently the mute button.
Exactly.
So it's a really interesting time to be doing this panel, and we actually bumped it up. We were going to have it a few weeks later in the summer, but due to the events taking place, we thought it was really important to start doing it now. The two things that I really want to focus on to draw our attention to this battle over free speech is the first was a very interesting challenge to the conservative website known as the Federalist. And Dave, you're good friends with several of the publishers over there, so maybe you'll walk us through what the challenge was. But essentially, there was an attempt to deplatform them from Google and Google Ads. And I think it's a pretty interesting textbook case that's worth looking at. And then the other recent event, if I can do some self-promotion, I have a piece at the American Mind that went up last week, which I titled The Securitization of Hate Speech. And I wanted to look at how increasingly free speech has been narrowed under a security argument. So that's sort of where we're at right now. So Dave, why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened to the Federalist and maybe some ideas of what we can draw from it?
Sure. Well, thank you for that introduction. It's not quite clear exactly what happened with Google and the Federalist. There's stuff that we sort of think we know, and there's what was going on at Google internally, which we have really no visibility into. That's actually another part of this problem here, because we don't have any transparency into a lot of the machinations internally of the tech oligopoly. We don't have Freedom of Information Acts and things like this to see what they're really doing. Even though, I mean, as we know, FOIAs are, FOIAs are great. Maybe within 10 years we'll find out what the government did 20 years prior. But what happened with the Federalist was Google is alleged to have received a complaint from NBC News, which was sort of working with, or let's say laundering, the Oppo research of frankly a leftist deplatforming outfit, similar to Hope Not Hate out of the UK. And they've got a hit list of conservative sites that they deem hateful and should be deplatformed. And very, very seamlessly, the NBC reporter worked with this group to instigate Google into doing something. So it was the Federalist, and it was also Zero Hedge. It could have been other websites as well. Those are just really the two that we know about. Because Google controls, I don't know, somewhere north of 80% of the ad buys online, they have tremendous power. I mean, they have monopoly type of power in terms of determining what content is permissible, and what websites are sort of viable for monetization.
Sure. And one of the things I thought was interesting coming out of that was our good friend Robert Spencer over at Jihad Watch had a tweet where he pointed out, what is being attempted here with the Federalist has already happened to me, and has already happened to many individuals that operate in what we think of as the counter-jihad space. And that's what got me thinking, what lessons can we learn from the counter-jihad space to apply to this current assault on free speech? For those of you who don't know, Robert's website, Jihad Watch, faced efforts at demonetization. Credit card companies attempted to stop processing donations to his site, sorts of things. And so he really, he's right when he says he was at the forefront of some of this cancellation behavior. And so I started thinking back to, how I got into the challenge of the counter-jihad space. And for me, and I don't know about you, Dave, maybe you talked a little bit about how you perceived this, but what motivated me and how I got into it really was the Danish cartoon controversy, which, for those you don't know, was in 2006, and a Danish newspaper sought out individuals to draw cartoons of the Prophet Muhammad as part of an article about self-censorship among artists. And actually, nothing happened from that. The cartoons were printed. Later, however, a imam in Denmark spread those cartoons throughout the Middle East. They led to riots, days of rage, violence, attempts to boycott Denmark. And a very aggressive free speech campaign began to limit what you could and couldn't say about Islam. And that was when I sort of realized that there was a larger threat involved in the counter-jihad space than simply one of terrorism. There was an ideological threat involved. And I think that was the case for quite a few people, is that they realized that the situation was much more dire than a few terrorists in caves somewhere in Afghanistan. I mean,
yeah.
Sense, Dave?
Look, that's my story exactly. I mean, I was in New York for 9/11. I was, I was following the news and I was up on this stuff, but it was the Danish cartoon controversy and the backlash that turned me into an activist. I was living in San Francisco. The first protest I ever went to in my adult life was supporting in front of the Danish embassy or the consulate in San Francisco, and there was a riot. And when you see these things up close, it's radicalizing.
By which you mean the lawful protesters were attacked by people who wanted to shut them up. Yeah.
Yes, and it was scary. That was the first time that I had a guy, on the other side of the fence just spit into my face, an old man, and it was shocking because I had I had naively thought that this was America. Yeah, I didn't quite realize that I had moved to the Bay Area, and it's funny because there were some folks that I met there at that protest. I showed up. I had, we were doing this like, we were all online, and I mean this stuff still happens where we're online, and it was just a meetup, and several of us met, and we are many of us are still in touch.
And it was funny because it really became, I think, one of the central questions of the struggle against jihadist terrorism, and one that the Center for Security Policy became sort of centrally focused on, which was the realization that if you can't speak freely about a threat, you can't analyze it accurately. And if you can't analyze it, you can't understand it. And if you can't understand it, you can't win. And that became sort of the central organizing argument of our approach to counterterrorism, was you had to be able to talk freely about how jihadists understood themselves and their goals. And if you couldn't talk about the jihadist view of Islam, you couldn't do that.
Right.
And
No,
so that's why free speech became a fundamentally national security question. And I think it was today.
And a lot of people didn't understand it at the time. The people who did not, who sort of were not operating in the let's say the counter-jihad space, they just fundamentally didn't understand it. And I think some traditional conservatives started to wake up when the UN got involved, which was, I know we'll probably get to Resolution 1618. What year was that? That was 2011, maybe?
That sounds about right, yeah. And obviously, 1618 was a UN resolution aimed at what was sort of euphemistically called defamation of religion, but was in fact sort of strictly focused on defamation of Islam. And it led to the US government under the Obama administration directly engaging with a variety of Middle Eastern governments on this question of what you could say or not say about Islam. And the Obama administration, I almost said caved, and that's not quite right, because I don't think they caved so much as they participated in a process intended to change our view of how we regarded free speech rights. I mean, would that be your take on it, Dave?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the central, just to go back over that, sort of the central premise of 1618 was that it flipped the sort of it gave a heckler's veto. It gave away a heckler's veto. So it would. And I mean, it came sort of part and parcel with what Hillary Clinton's State Department was doing at the time, which was sort of, in response to the 2012 Benghazi attacks. They blamed a movie, and they came out and they said that basically if someone incites you to commit violence, then that's the fault of the inciter, which
right.
Of course
I get into this in the American Mind piece, up at our website, securetfreedom.org, and you're quite right. What they did was they inverted the concept of incitement, such that in traditional American jurisprudence, incitement to violence is a limitation on free speech, but it implies a sort of immediacy, intent on behalf of the speaker to engage in, to encourage others to engage in violence. So actually what we see from, for example, some of these Antifa riots, where they quite openly encourage people to engage in criminal activity on a particular day, in a particular place, would qualify for what we traditionally think of as incitement to violence. But what the process by which the Obama administration, working together with various foreign partners, engaged in was inverting this concept, such that the speaker was responsible for any violence that resulted from his speech, even if that violence was against him himself. So if I say something that Dave does not like, and Dave engages in violence against me to shut me up, it is my fault, because I should not have made him angry. And this was the incitement as it was construed in things like Resolution 1618 and other international agreements moving forward. And as you rightly noted, Dave, we saw the sort of final expression of that in the Benghazi YouTube video incident, where they actually arrested the filmmaker who had made a sort of embarrassingly amateurish film, raising various questions about Muhammad, and they used this to say it was that he was responsible for a coordinated terrorist attack against a U.S. embassy. And what has struck me is that we sort of, as we were approaching this in the counter jihad space, we sort of assumed that this was a standard that existed just in relation to jihadist violence. And I think increasingly what we have seen is that this standard has now gone mainstream, such that we see it being applied to things like the Berkeley riots against conservative speakers on college campuses that took place back in 2014, 2015. And even as we move forward today, looking at sort of the civil unrest that we're seeing, again, it's being implied that the individual is not responsible for their violence. They are provoked by the person who said something they didn't like. And this is, of course, Dave, is a really dire threat to the U.S. view on free speech.
Yeah, I mean, we just saw it. I mean, not an hour ago, I came across a crazy article saying about how it was in regards to that assault with the black guy and his brother assaulted the white guy at Macy's, and President Trump ended up tweeting out a little clip of the video, and there was an article that on a kind of black nationalist site that there was defending the assailant on sort of the grounds that, structural racism is white supremacy is violence, so it's all good. But I mean, but back to like 1618 and some of this other stuff. I know when we were discussing what to do on the panel, I shot an email because I was going back through and I was reading about 1618 last night in preparation, and I was thinking, man, it was really quaint when they even used to make arguments.
And sophisticated arguments.
Right. And they really no longer do, because now it's enough just to say, this is hate speech, and they just kind of walk away from it because they assume probably correctly that they've won the argument as far as state power is concerned.
Right. I mean, when you're at the stage where you are canceling a website's ability to accept donations, you no longer really have to discuss what the ideas that website promotes are, right? Which is where we are today, where
right, and by all
smaller sites and then moves on.
Yeah, and arguing that I mean, we all saw this as our friend Ace of Spades called it. The deplatforming of people like Alex Jones was just proof of concept. It wasn't where it was going to stop. Many of us saw that. But I mean, the other thing that is really important to note too is that at the end of the day, this is all about ideas. And one of the things that sort of got me into this business was this fascination with the idea that rhetoric and ideas really move the world. Because you see a guy toppling a statue of Andrew Jackson in Lafayette Park, or trying to. It's ideas that got him to do that, and it's not just one idea. It's not just he didn't go temporarily insane and do something completely random. He accepted several, many distinct ideas, one built on top of the next, that would lead him to seeing that as a reasonable, laudable, and necessary thing to do. Now, it's the same thing when we talk about jihadis, which is, again, I mean, what got you and I into this business.
Right. Yeah.
is because we saw that, and we saw that these guys were not acting out at random. In fact, what they were doing was eminently logical and eminently reasonable based on their sets of beliefs, and those sets of beliefs can be understood and can be grappled with and quantified and argued with. But it's not just temporary insanity, and that's the same thing with the left. And I go back. One of the things I read last night again in kind of preparation for this was Marcuse's repressive tolerance, and I am not
Talk to us a little bit about who Marcuse is.
I'm sorry?
Just for the audience, just let them know who Marcuse is.
Oh, he's a character in the Coen Brothers' Hail Caesar. But more than that, I mean, he was a Frankfurt School philosopher who was sort of the crucial philosophical link between the Frankfurt School and the New Left. So we know about a lot of the Frankfurt School guys that sort of decamped to the New School and from Germany, and continued that movement in the United States. But Marcuse went one step further, which is he went out to California, and he helped set what ended up being known as the 60s counterculture in motion. And he wrote a piece called Repressive Tolerance in 1965, where he basically argued that tolerating, in a sort of free capitalist society, the deck is stacked against, let's just say, socialism, and tolerating the expressions of freedom is hateful, is not appropriate to the struggle, let's say, to put it in the most charitable terms. And
right.
and he pushed the idea of censorship of things that are not on the left. And it's funny because you read him and it's really hard not to see the kind of later echoes of the structural racism argument. And I don't think very many people bought it at the time, but I think by the time the late 70s came around, and the 80s too, in the late 80s you had Chomsky's manufacturing consent. And manufacturing consent is a critique of the media that I think a lot of conservatives today sort of stupidly entertain, because it contains a small fraction of things which are true, but those things that are true are weaponized against a free society. It's funny that there's a little footnote that I was reading about how China. How in China they're studying the works of Chomsky and manufacturing consent and how the media works and blah, 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 and all this. But they're quick to note that in a closed society, none of Chomsky's criticisms are valid. So basically what another way to explain what they're doing is, the Chinese in a closed totalitarian society are learning about all of the horrible deficiencies of the American media and the American political system.
And how to exploit them.
Yeah. No.
Right.
Exactly.
And I think one of the things you point out with the shift away from sort of what we think of as the peace and love 60s, free speech, free tolerance, the shift away from that, which happened, I think surprised a lot of people in our space. We're working on issues of jihad and terrorist violence, and of course the tendency by jihadis to engage in very horrific violence against women, very horrific violence against homosexuals, pointing out, for example, tendency to engage in behaviors like slavery and racism. And we thought that we could use that issue to spur the left to action and create a sense of unity around this threat or against this threat, right? To say that, well, actually, all identities in America are faced with threat from jihadism and jihad, and so we should all unite to defeat it. And that didn't happen. It sort of distinctly did not happen. And we've seen similar from our pro-Israel allies. They ran into the same issue, where they said, Israel is the most tolerant place in the Middle East, and yet it cannot get the left on its side. And it's because they did not understand that this tremendous shift in thinking had taken place, at least in the radical left, about what should be tolerated, such that they were far more concerned with speech against jihadists than speech by jihadists, which is one of the important factors in understanding these restrictions on speech never fall equally.
Right.
They never fall.
It was tremendously naive.
Both sides.
It was tremendously naive. I know that some of us were screaming at the time that it was tremendously naive. Because at the end of the day, you're fighting an uphill battle in a couple different ways. First is the sort of the old free speech Enlightenment logic had been demystified, and I mentioned Marcuse because that was sort of the first little nail in with the new left wanting to undermine the concept of free expression, which is kind of really an old radical left, an old communist point of view, which is if free expression goes against the party, then the hell with it. But there was still some sort of, let's say, naive idea of Voltaire and the importance of free expression on the left.
Which is what we saw. We saw the great irony just this past week of Voltaire's statue being defaced.
Sure.
And they know what they're doing. How much more poignant can you make the point that, in fact, they will not defend to the death your right to speak? Than that.
Look. The other thing too, and Chomsky made me think of it, but all of these sort of systemic arguments, all of we have systemic racism, we have systemic this, systemic that, all of those arguments sort of against the American founding cut against our Enlightenment principles, all of them. And especially free speech as well. So I mean, we're at the point where it's just, unfortunately, I think we've seen polling on this. It's not I don't have it in front of me, but I think everyone's seen polling to the effect that young people, 2/3 of young people, are opposed to, want to criminalize hate speech and can't define it, and are against free expression in the way that, let's say, our parents and grandparents would understand it. So I think we're kind of beyond the tipping point in the United States where this stuff doesn't matter, and it has effects. It doesn't. It's not only the things you say, and it's not only the ability for the Federalist to publish conservative writing, or for you to tweet what you want online. I mean, as you rightly noted in the piece of about the securitization of this stuff, is if it's sort of natural and inevitable that it becomes a national security threat. And I remember back when we were starting off and we were in both kind of working in the counter-jihad space, and we used to encounter these folks who were, let's say, the big one that I remember was the Charity and Security Network. Remember those guys?
Oh, so yeah, they're still quite very active. For those who don't know, Charity and Security Network is a large network that focuses almost exclusively on preventing the government from using material support laws to target charities that fund terrorism. They're very opposed to material support laws, for example, like the laws that the government used against the Holy Land Foundation for supporting Hamas, and they are in fact big supporters of the Holy Land Foundation. So that's the group
right. So they sort of, they had a goal in mind, which was, and look, they were and remain very smart, which is they had a goal in mind, which was, okay, some of our guys just got rolled up because they were Hamas and they were raising money for Hamas. What do we do now? We gradually have to figure out how to, if we're not going to get Hamas delisted, then at least we're going to muddy the waters a little bit and sort of break down the edifice of the the concept of material support. And the other thing that they did, and a lot of other people who were sort of we can say honestly objectively pro-terrorist, pro-jihadi at that time did, was they used to say, well, it's only you're criminalizing dissent. Yeah, sure, you want to topple yeah, sure, you want to topple America, you want to install an Islamic caliphate, but that's all protected speech, you see.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, free speech for me, but not for thee, has been the hallmark.
These are the same people who are attempting today to criminalize what used to be known as American patriotism and love for the Constitution and reverence for the founding fathers, and what your parents or grandparents would think of as being as being patriotism. Sort
Which
of under the same rubrics.
In the piece, part of that flows out of the decision by the government, led by the Obama administration, to transform all of counterterrorism into this countering violent extremism narrative. And when you do that, you are focused on belief, which, as Dave and I said, we were interested in getting the government to care about what jihadis believed. And on the one hand, you would think, well, extremism is all about what people believe, so that must be good. But the issue was that they didn't care what the specifics of your beliefs were or understanding how they applied to your actions. They only cared how intensely you believed it. So on the one hand, being a jihadist, a member of an organized terrorist organization that conducts attacks all across the country, you are now a mere extremist. It sort of lessens what you actually are. Whereas on the other hand, you can equally be an extremist for the Constitution or the First Amendment or the Second Amendment or any other number of beliefs, some of which are laudatory. And because everything came down to the question of belief. So now you have a situation where people who speak are being given a moniker equated with terrorism, while terrorists are being a moniker so now terrorism is free speech and free speech is terrorism, essentially, in other words.
Yeah, that's where we are. And what this this kind of whole long episode unmasks is the idea that if they're in power, they're going to keep pushing. And it's important now to stay on the lookout and see what rhetoric they use, to see what are the ideas that are in fashion that that seem to start animating people on the on the academic and then the activist side. I mean, you see, I mean, one of the things that I would love to take the time to explore too is this White Fragility book and sort of PR campaign. I mean, I think the author has been on several shows, and I know it kind of takes us slightly afield from the topic where we're discussing, but things like that are really important. Ta-Nehisi Coates' book is really important, it's important because it gives us the ability to sort of see what's coming if these ideas percolate through the culture. And I think that by now it should be assumed that sort of the crazier and more totalitarian the idea, and then the rhetoric, the more comprehensively it will permeate through the culture at some point.
I wanted to turn slightly, Dave, to looking at some of the apparatus by which the suppression of free speech is done. So we've talked a little bit about the government and the inversion of incitement and sort of cause and effect there. And we talked a little bit about countering violent extremism. And I was hoping you would talk to me a little bit about the media's role in all of this. Historically, sort of going back to about 2010, maybe 2008, before, the way we sort of saw these things work was you'd have a group like CARE, you'd have a group like the SPLC, who, by the way, they work very closely together. They would sort of label somebody as an Islamophobe or a racist or whatever their issue was, and the media would report on it. And they would say, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, person X, Y, or Z is a bad person. And then, of course, that now being in print, it could be taken to that person's bank or that person's employer or what have you, and that person could be deplatformed. Unpersoned. Now, I feel like, and I look to you because I feel like you understand the media far better than I do. I feel like the media has now skipped a step almost entirely.
Yeah, it's something that I've definitely noticed, and frankly, I think it would make a decent piece, which is the media is just going and picking off the former. I mean, in many ways, it's sort of consolidating ideologically and picking off the former parts of its supply chain and just putting it all in house. So as you rightly noted, you had a group like SPLC or CARE or Right Wing Watch or Hope Not Hate. There's a whole constellation of them, and they would do the they would do the opposition research, and then they would go to the media, get it written up. And as you said, other activists would then take the article and weaponize it by trying to deperson them. So now what you're seeing is all of this happen sort of under one roof. The media is the doxing unit. The media is the oppo unit. The media goes themselves to label.
Yeah, this is you see this. It'll be something like, and this is in fact what NBC did with the federal situation. Is right. NBC went to Google and said, "What about these guys? What are you going to do about them?"
Right. The Oliver Darcy and K-File at CNN. I mean, this is what these guys do. This is the job description. The job description is moving, the old oppo and doxing operation in house. So so they no longer have to rely on it. I mean, the other interesting thing happened is, as you know, you mentioned the SPLC. You know, the Southern Poverty Law Center used to be, it was valuable for exactly one, to the left and the media, for exactly one reason, which is it gave them the ability to say, you know, so and so and so, comma, you know, who is a anti-Muslim hater according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, comma, blah 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 blah. So it was that title, that rubber stamp, that little bit of legitimacy
We
for
spoke
the
to the
article.
experts, and they told us.
Yes, and that's what an SPLC existed for, no other reason than for that tagging, you know, for that tagging to occur. And I think at some point the media decided that the tagging isn't even the most important part. They could get by without the tagging. They don't even need to make a concession to say, oh, we got this from some third party. They will just now assert, you know, anti-Muslim so and so.
Yeah, Mr. X,
and
an anti-Muslim speaker, blank, and
right,
then they go off.
Right. I mean, I remember when things like this first started happening, and I would contact reporters and then say, "What are you talking about? You know, how do you just casually slander someone like this?" And at first, some of the reporters apologized and they removed it. You know, some of them came back and they said, oh, well, you know, SPLC says you are, or Hope Not Hate says you are, or People for the American Way says you are, whatever it is. But now they just kind of tell you, you know, to get lost. And, you know, it's none of this happens. I mean, we should probably,
you are because we say you are.
Right. Probably the preamble to this talk, or the subtitle, probably maybe for any such future talks should be, you know, wages of media radicalization, because I think a lot of this is not possible without the ratcheting up of wokeness on the part of reporters and editors over the last several years. And you know, something that you and I discuss, because we've been talking about defense, but we often discuss the sort of offense component of this battle too, which is that in our work we encounter plenty of people that say plenty of objectionable stuff, and we believe that a fair hearing of that makes a difference to, you know, public discourse and perhaps to some debates on policy. So, you know, that manifests.
I mean, the classic example would be, you know, this individual. You know, we would do a report, something like this individual, you know, made these statements in support of jihadist violence, and we think that you should know that.
Right. Yeah. Or something as simple as, you know, hey, this guy who's coming to, you know, to lecture at this mosque, as a special guest, raised, you know, several $1 million for Hamas. Is that relevant? Is it relevant that people know that? Yeah, I think, you know, you and I and many Americans would think that, you know,
it is. Yeah.
Hell yes, it's relevant. So our ability, you know, to put out stories like that over the course of the last decade really has taken a hit, and it's come to, and of course the media's kind of woke radicalization has played a big part of that, which is that not only do they come after us, they make it impossible for us or anyone else to go after bad guys.
Mm-hmm. Because these things don't, they're not applied equally. You know,
sure.
In the same way that the media drops, you know, the tagline anti-Muslim according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, if they mention at all one of our concerns. It will be, you know, the Council on American Islamic Relations, an organization with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, according to the Center for Security Policy, which of course is not true. It's not according to me. It's according to the federal government and archival documents.
Right.
But it doesn't apply to us the same way. The rules do not apply equally across.
Yeah, and the free speech. The other thing that the kind of war on our free speech does and did is it made sure that only the most committed folks are covering this beat at all, because everyone else gets scared off, mostly for their professional reputation, for their professional reputations. So, I mean, you and I can name several prominent former journalists who used to, or you know, formerly prominent journalists who used to cover terror finance and the terrorism beat, the Muslim Brotherhood beat, things like that, in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, in papers like this. I mean, remember that great one in Texas Monthly?
Mm-hmm.
Now try to get something in Texas Monthly, or try to get something in the Dallas Morning News.
Right. Who almost literally, Dallas Morning News almost literally wrote the book on the Holy Land Foundation trial. And I remember a few years back, I tried to get a piece published by the Dallas Morning News, and I cited only articles published in the Dallas Morning News as evidence for my arguments, and they still wouldn't take it. And so it's the case where our facts are not equal to their opinions,
Right.
which is a very, very challenging media environment to be operating in. And we're seeing even this institutionalized, I think, with the current fervor over disinformation.
Yes.
You know, we talked a little bit about how they used the tag of extremism, and they spread it broadly over those they don't like, and thinly over those that they do like, in order to limit speech, because it might be extremist. But now they're moving in a different direction, I think. They're moving in this direction of disinformation, so that things that are reported that they do not wish to be true are treated as though they are ipso facto part of a foreign influence campaign or a foreign information campaign. Now, of course, it's absolutely true that foreign governments engage in this behavior, and the U.S. government does have a role in trying to show that these sort of activities are taking place. But this is taking place privately, not at the behest of the government, but at the behest of Google or at the behest of Facebook, to say what is or isn't true, one. And two, they label as disinformation simply information that they don't like, or that comes from sources they don't like. So if they don't like what the source has to say, or they don't like the source, the information is untrue. Or at a minimum, it comes from, you know, they'll tag it as coming from a source known for printing disinformation, regardless of the truth of the article in question. And so, and again, it's covered under, it's given the cover of a security aspect, because they'll claim, well, you know, this could be the Russians or something.
Right.
I mean, have you seen, how do you, I mean,
how do you combat that? I mean,
I should mention Dave is working on a monograph for us about Qatari foreign influence, and one of the things he highlights very successfully, I think, and I'm looking forward to sharing this with our audience, is how this Russia hoax, on the one hand, created a fervor over this question of foreign influence, and on the other hand, allowed other foreign influencers to operate unscathed. So yeah, Dave, how do we combat this situation where the platforms upon which one speaks are acting as publishers, acting as content clearinghouses over what is true and what is not true?
Right. So I think the first thing that we need to do in order to combat it is be honest with ourselves. And what that means is if you are depending on the goodwill of others, if you are depending on the media to wake up and say, hey, this thing that we've been doing that's been benefiting us, we're going to stop doing that just because it's not nice. And we're going to go back to a situation where we're going to put a lot more effort into being very objective, and we're going to be responsible, and it's going to be, sort of, back to the old days where there was a pretense of objectivity. I think the sooner we could dispense with that absurdity, the better. And once
there
we
is
really,
no going back, in other words.
yeah, there is no going back. And once we internalize how dumb, how silly it is to cling to this idea that will the bad man stop beating me, then the sooner we can sort of figure out new strategies. Now, I don't think there is a new strategy. I don't think there's a way to get around the fact that we need to be talking primarily to our own people. That's not to say that the era of convincing is over, but I think from here on out, it's just absolutely paramount to ensure reliable or relatively reliable networks of communications with folks who are our supporters, and with folks who are our audience and our base. What that means is kind of multifaceted, from the perspective of social media. Let's say it's doing like what Dan Bongino is doing on with Parler, developing a place where folks can communicate outside of the censorious machinations of Twitter and Jack Dorsey. Will it be the same? No, it won't be the same. Will it be as good? It will not be as good, but it will be just us. And we have to get comfortable with the idea that just us is okay. I know that that's very hard for someone, let's say, who lives in New York and half their family and their friends are on the left, and they have to sort of pose as the very reasonable conservative who's not too crazy. I know that that's very difficult. But at a certain point, people are going to have to choose.
Well, I think in that it highlights, and you make a good point, and I think it highlights also a current challenge that we have faced, which is that, as you rightly pointed out, what we used to call the mainstream media, now we might call the left media, has moved increasingly into an activist direction. What we used to think of as the conservative media has sought, largely unsuccessfully, to take its place in being the determiner of who calls balls and strikes, and sort of being fair to everybody. And so you have an approach where various outlets, they try to be very even-handed about things, even though they are, in accordance with their masthead, a conservative outlet. And so they don't want to cover, or they may be reluctant to cover articles of the kind that you and I write, because they'll say, well, that's the kind of content that sort of goes in a niche publication, and they want to be a mainstream publication because they feel like the left has abandoned the mainstream publication. But the reality is that the gravitas of being the mainstream does not convey upon these conservatives, even though they seek to moderate themselves.
Right. No, I mean, that's a good point. The gravitas definitely does not convey. I mean, they're still they're still the pathetic outcasts in many ways, and they will never be invited into the club. But I mean, going back to sort of of next steps in how you combat this. So we say first is being secure in knowing that you are shoring up your base, you are talking to your own people. Number two is figuring out how to make sure that's reliable. So one thing, as I mentioned, was Parler. Another thing, frankly, would be going and helping to support folks who are creating content whose views you like. I mean, full disclosure, I just set up an account at Dave Rubin's site, Locals. You can find me there, and you'll help support my work and the things that the things that I do, and sort of create a new community to talk about these things. Maybe step 3 is to do more of the in-person encounters, or to move to places where you're physically together with people who who are your friends, and who think like you, and see the situation in the same way.
And where you can speak freely.
Dave, where you can speak freely.
That's pretty much all the time we have for today. I appreciate you taking the time to speak with us, and for all the audience out there for joining us. We've been talking about the assault on free speech and the lessons that we can learn from the counter-jihad movement and its challenges with free speech, and then how that applies to today. And Dave Reboy, a Center for Security Policy Senior Fellow and President for Strategic Improvisation, and a great master, if I may say so, of dealing with the media, has been walking us through some of these issues. So Dave, thank you very much, and we appreciate all of you for joining us. Please tune in again next week when we'll return, I think, to our regular Wednesday time period for these for these chats. So thank you, everyone, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you very much.